All right. Hello, my name is Bruce Becker, and I'm the president of FQTQ. We are a small risk management company that's located in Frederick, Maryland. We've intentionally kept the invitation list to this webinar short because we are recording it, but we did want representatives of the food industry here to ask questions during the 10-minute question and answer session. So please understand you're not only representing yourself, your company, but your whole industry. And so thank you all for being here. We're going to try not to mute things. If you wanted to mute yourself, that's fine. And if things get a little out of control, I'll mute it from here. But so far, it sounds like everyone's doing well. So let's get started. First off, I would like to introduce you to Dr. Josephine Head from Head Consultancy, who is joining us from the UK. Head Consultancy works exclusively with the European food industry, and we were fortunate enough to make her acquaintance many months ago as we began exploring together the horse gate issue, which was the industrial scale problem of adding horse meat to ground beef in the UK, in Europe. So Joe, please take over for your message to the folks.
Well, thank you very much for introducing me and the opportunity this presents. We actually got together, or I found you guys back in October last year before the horse situation arose. I'm very keen to look for new innovative tools that are going to help challenge the status quo and move the industry forwards, and I believe very strongly that this is a key part of that objective. So I'm here today with Bruce and John Ignacio, who's the Chief Science Officer of FQTQ. As Bruce has mentioned, we were contacted by, well, I don't think he did actually. One of the things he possibly meant to mention was that part of this initiative, we were contacted by one of Europe's largest retailers to conduct a study of food fraud in Europe involving beef supply and horse meat. And this whole series intends to grow from that. Basically, this is a direct result of that initiative. We've been working on this since March of this year, I believe, and together we've learned an enormous amount about food fraud, but the one thing that has particularly impressed and surprised us the most is how little we really understood about the problem. And at the moment, the industry is scratching its head, hiding behind more audits and DNA testing and not really knowing which direction to go in. So that's what we're intending to do, is provide them a solution to actually be able to go there just as a collective rather than just as individuals. So a big part of today's webinar is to begin the process of sharing what we know with you, and just, if not more importantly, determine what we don't know about the issue of food fraud to mitigate the issues going forward. The additional priority for us is to seek your input about what we can and should be doing to curb the problem and mitigate the risks. We're never going to stop it, but we can do an awful lot more about it. Thirdly, but not least, we want to take what we collectively learn and do something about it. It's quite sickening to look at what's being spoken about. Think like a criminal is one suggestion, but suggestions as to how to actually go there are sincerely lacking. So today begins the first in a series of 4. The first one is going to address the scope and nature of the problem across a number of the most hard-hit food commodity lines. The second one will involve the detection of food fraudsters and the specific food fraud countermeasures we can take to prevent food fraud. The third will address the nature and role of food fraud assessments along the supply chain if we're going to curb the food fraud issue. The fourth and final webinar, which is the one I'm most excited about, because I've been privy to all of the above up till now, is bringing together all of these ideas and any other ideas we receive from you and any others in the industry on a solution to the problem. The interactive sessions work like this. We're going to break up the hour session into 2 blocks of 20 minutes. So we give you a presentation dealing with different aspects of food fraud. At the end of each of those, we stop for 10 minutes to take observations, comments and questions from all of you guys. We consider these discussions to be the meat and potatoes of the webinar because it allows all participants to share information. We have only 10 minutes in that process, so we need to ask everyone to be concise and focused in your observations if at all possible. We'll try our best to answer any questions you may have during those 10-minute sessions. And if for any reason we don't get to a question or give you a good enough answer, you will have all our contact information to call us or drop us an email. There's going to be also a blog that you can reach us on as well. I'd like to introduce my like-minded John Honacio, a scientist like myself. He is the Chief Science Officer at FoodQuest and has many years' experience in risk management. In the first half of his career with the US government, John was heavily involved in the safety and security of nuclear weapons and spent significant time in the US, Russian Federation, Europe and South America working to reduce global risk posed by nuclear weapons, something you wouldn't necessarily associate with food fraud, but unfortunately we're talking on very parallel lines. John is a former Deputy Federal Marshal, worked with the FBI, Secret Service and US intelligence community, foreign governments to understand and fight criminal activities, including the investigation of fraudulent activities involving nuclear materials. John's contact information appears here, and if you've got any questions after the webinar, John has asked me to tell you to please call him. So thanks again for this opportunity. I'm very much looking forward to these sessions. It's always good to know what you don't know as well as what you do know. So let's get the session started. So back to you, John.
Thank you, Joe. First of all, hello, everybody. And I want to thank Joe for that introduction. Before I begin, I want to just, emphasize what Bruce told you earlier. What we'd like to do is follow the Chatham House rules in this webinar. This means that any of the personal comments or observations or ideas that anyone shares with us during this session are not attributable to any single person and stay within the confines of the webinar. And the most important thing for us is candor so that we can do our job the best way. And so we wanted to ask everybody to please honor that approach. Now we're on slide 7, Bruce. And we're going to cover 5 things today. First of all, it's a lot of information, so please bear with me if it feels like a fire hose. I will try and be as clear and concise as I can and cover these things. But as I said earlier, please just give me a call or write me an email, and I will try and answer any questions that you have about the material. We recognize that the people here today and the people who are engaged in food fraud across the industry have different levels of experience and knowledge as it relates specifically to food fraud. If you know something the rest of us don't, please interrupt us and tell us. That's really what this webinar and these series of webinars is really all about. In the first couple of webinars, we want to make sure that we have a general consensus on what the problem really is. The way to do that was to start at the beginning and then build on it to develop a collective solution for the industry. So first, we're going to share some of the research we did trying to determine in some plausible way, and I underline plausible, the true cost of food fraud across several hard-hit commodities. Second, we're going to talk a bit about the enemy, so to speak, in this case, the bad guys who commit food fraud. Third, we're going to share with you some of the different means and methods. In other words, what the bad guys actually do to commit food fraud. Fourth, and perhaps more important than anything else, we're going to try and get a handle on the highest risk areas for food fraud by commodity type and location on the production chain. What that does is it allows us to really focus our limited resources on those areas of highest risk. And last but not least, we're going to see how the information we covered today will set the basis for the next webinar. Okay, we're on slide 8, Bruce. By the end of today's session, all of us should share the same knowledge base on the topic of food fraud. And the idea here is that what we want you to be able to do is take this information and structure the information in the context of your own company. So this is food for thought that you'll take with you before the next webinar, which will be on September 4th, where we'll go into countermeasures. You'll have an idea for the true cost of food fraud based on the available data. You'll get a feeling for who commits food fraud and how they think. Fifth, we're going to spend some time talking about the criminal enterprise, or as most of us know it, organized crime, as the major factor in industrial scale food fraud. So there's a big difference between petty shysters taking advantage of, a small opportunity to commit food fraud versus the organized kind. We're going to go over several methods and means relating to hard-hit food commodities that food fraudsters actually use today. We're going to end today's session with perhaps the most important thing of all, which is an overall assessment of food fraud that's going to show you where to focus the limited resources based on the best scientific analysis we could do given the anecdotal, and I underscore anecdotal nature of the food fraud problem. We're on slide 9. In trying to pull the industry together, we had the opportunity to talk in general terms about the food fraud problem with a whole bunch of people. In most cases, they greeted us with interest and really expressed the need and desire to come up with new ways to combat food fraud. So we were very pleased the vast majority of folks felt that way. But there were a few serious skeptics out there. And I'm going to talk just about that for a second because it's so important to understand how some people are thinking about this problem. In some cases, we talked to people who said, listen, we've already conducted our own internal risk assessments of food fraud, and we're already asking all of the right questions, and we're taking all the actions necessary to prevent food fraud. Well, we found that kind of interesting because if we're already doing that, we really shouldn't have a food fraud problem. And then we were startled when we started seeing the numbers and the loss numbers from food fraud. Somehow that didn't match up. And of course, the bottom line to me as a scientist in all this is I don't think we're asking the right questions of the right people at the right place. And I think that's the answer in a nutshell to the food fraud problem. The skeptics really wanted us to go one step further. They wanted us to provide them with the names of people they could arrest. That's kind of really hard to do from the outside in when you're not working for the food company and if your responsibilities aren't around food fraud. Just an extremely difficult thing to do. However, one of the major things that we'll be talking about in webinar number 2 is actionable intelligence and how we might be able to actually help them with this problem by providing a broad array of intelligence information relating to food fraud that can be used to actually do things to prevent it. So that'll be an exciting topic next time on the 4th when we get together. Now, slide number 10, reports on the scope of the food fraud problem. First, I'm going to be very honest with you as a scientist. All of the information I looked out there on, food fraud costs this much or it costs this much per commodity chain and everything else was not science-based. No solid statistical or economic basis at all for it. In fact, most of the major studies we came across really dodged the issue by entirely just making up numbers. Of course, that's not a very, very good thing to do when you're trying to understand a problem and, more importantly, solve it. So a big challenge for us is finding the information we need to make rational judgments on the whole issue of food fraud. Most of the studies we looked at were based on metaphor rather than analogy. And metaphor is the thing that the politicians say when they don't really know what they're talking about. they say things like, hey, listen, we've got to put the brakes on inflation, even though, you know, a macroeconomy has absolutely nothing to do with the parts of a car. Not a very scientific way to think or to talk about problems. Analogy, on the other hand, is totally different because it's based on scientific extrapolation, like solid statistical modeling. And I wanted to make the point, from our end, our objective is to do this in a defensible scientific way. That's what we believe the food fraud problem needs to have. Now, most of our experience in food fraud comes from companies that have been publicly had, and so they're newspaper articles. To add to our lack of knowledge about the food fraud problem is the serious problem of underreporting. Who out there is willing to turn themselves in as being the victim of food fraud, or worse, actually committing it? Not very many people. So you can be sure that everything you've read about food fraud is probably underestimated. Finally, and certainly not least, is the fact that the government is not helping us solve this problem. From rulemaking to inspection to enforcement, they are not on top of this issue. It seems the government prefers to leave the hard solutions to us in the food industry. So a very, very important kind of base. So in order to beat food fraud, we need to do a better job of scientifically studying, understanding, and doing something different to combat the problem. If we're talking about the $1 billion of losses every year, we got to figure a way to cut those losses. Now, I'm going to run through very quickly some slides to show you and demonstrate how difficult it really is to come up with numbers on food fraud. A lot of this information is based on small-scale studies that are then extrapolated to cover a whole industry. And there's a lot of, I guess you could call it, nebulous territory involved when you begin to extrapolate at these levels. But nonetheless, here are the starting numbers, and the numbers that we developed. In each case, you see this little red deal down here? We developed it. It was kind of like going to grade school, where I had to develop a, deal with a very complex word problem and show my teacher that I knew what I was talking about. I developed an algorithm, basically, to come up with a number for each commodity. It's scientific, but the base information needs improvement. So it's a start. It's a methodology for looking at costs according to some rational measure of scientific truth. We start off with seafood. There are lots of studies out there, but the most recent study is the Oceana study. I'm sure all of you are familiar with that study. Based on their statistical sampling of a relatively small number, 33% of the fish that Americans eat is mislabeled. So when you think you're getting, red snapper, you're not. When you think you're eating tuna, you're probably eating, treated tilapia. Tilapia replaces lobster. Lots and lots of food fraud going on at some specific locations along the food supply chain that I'll talk about. But the bottom line for fish using our analysis is about $1.06 billion per year. And what we were coming up with in these numbers is what we know is actually taking place. And the numbers tell us what's taking place. Most people will tell you that the number is much, much higher. But this is the number we could defend. And we'll be happy to share with you these algorithms on how we have made determinations about the true value of food fraud. Olive oil. Tom Mueller wrote a great book on the sublime and the scandalous about the world of olive oil. According to him, 70% of all the extra virgin olive oil sold out there is mislabeled, which is a huge number. Good science-based studies have demonstrated, and this is the UC Davis study, that 69% of all imported olive oil and 10% of California's harvest do not meet the requirements for their extra virgin labels, which is a bit astounding. And what I want you to think about when you think about that statistic is How could that be unless the companies, the processors who are producing the olive oil were somehow not involved? 10% mislabeling of California extra virgin olive oil seems a bit strange, to say the least. The bottom line, after all is said and done on olive oil, is that it's costing a whopping $2.28 billion a year, according to our very, very conservative calculations in the U.S. alone. That's a huge number. Huge, huge number. Milk. There's almost no information on milk, and yet we hear anecdotally through news accounts all over the world that milk is one of the most commonly cut with water, and then we add additive proteins like melamine or pseudoproteins like melamine to increase what it looks like. We add clouding agents and thickeners. A huge problem globally, but I wasn't able to find any information on this issue. It's not talked about very much. It's based on anecdotal news reports. It's a liquid product, but our conclusion, based on the best numbers we can get, is that milk fraud in Canada, in the United States alone, is a $680 million loss for the industry, which again is really, really seems like a small number, but it's probably much higher than that. This is what we can defend. Honey fraud. Honey fraud, Americans eat a lot of honey, and most of it comes from China. And Asian honey is frequently tainted with heavy metals and antibiotics. In fact, almost all of the stuff tested is above those levels. But based on available data, in the U.S. alone, honey costs about $500 million a year. Now, this is definitely a global problem. It doesn't just affect the United States, but those were the numbers that we could find, and they dealt with the United States. So you can extrapolate to Europe or other portions of the world based on this number. A lot of people eat honey. Rice fraud. Rice is the most consumed food staple in the world. 77.3 per capita percent of the world and Asia represents rice. It's a huge issue. But we were only able to find some limited information on rice, and it was the basmati rice scandal in Europe of a couple of years ago that we used to come up with a number just in Europe of rice fraud. And that number was a really startling low number of $0.383 $100 million per year in Europe. Now, it's much larger when you consider Asia and those other numbers, but again, we were shooting for the most conservative number that we could find in order to give us a scientific idea of how big the problem really is. We're on now slide 16, Bruce. And you Europeans consume half of the milk chocolate in the world. That's why the Europeans are so sweet. They eat a lot of chocolate. But data on milk chocolate fraud is really, really hard to find. Suffice it to say that underreporting is probably a huge issue here, given the fact that some of the world's largest producers are under fire, and I mean a lot of public fire, for what consumers are calling fake chocolate. And fake chocolate is made by cutting cocoa butter with vegetable oil during the processing phase. And they're not, they're putting little small labels on it saying, we've cut the cocoa butter with vegetable oil, but it's, raising the wrath of the consumer because they think, we shouldn't be adding vegetable oil to our stuff and then selling it as regular milk chocolate. Our conclusion, based on the very meager data available, is that milk chocolate fraud, not including cocoa bean and cocoa liqueur production, is at least $240 million a year, at least. Very small number, but the only number that we could justify scientifically. Finally, we tried to crack the nut with hamburger. And we did this because of the experience in Europe and Horsegate, where we had industrial scale fraud with basically horse meat being used as a filler and then sold as beef. A very, very huge problem, a problem that really represents industrial scale fraud, and a lot of lessons to be learned from Horsegate for sure. To deduce a meaningful number, we actually had to go right down to the level of the beef patty, and we used a hamburger sandwich, which, you know, is a global phenomenon. Everybody likes a hamburger sandwich. Well, in the United States alone, we eat 40 billion hamburgers a year. That's a huge number. And every hamburger has about 1/3 pound of minced or ground beef associated with it. So what we did is we looked at the price per pound of beef on average, and we said 1/3 of a pound is, you know, worth so much, and then we did the math. And what we found is, wow, the opportunity for food fraud around beef is huge. And it was about a $1.6 billion per year estimate of food fraud having to do with hamburger sandwiches. It doesn't have to do with, you know, cut meats or anything else. This is strictly trying to get an angle on it from the minced beef problem, where most of the fraud occurs. Okay. With that said, we have estimated sample losses for food, and you can see that the numbers are very conservative that we give. We give a likely number, and we also give possibilities. And these possibilities are probably more likely where things are happening. It's right here in the third column on slide 18. So what we have is a $6.4 billion a year, at least, minimum problem, but it's just the tip of what we believe is a much, much bigger iceberg, that once I get the numbers, I'll be able to share with you what the real scope and the losses to industry really are from food fraud. Now, what does this mean for individual companies? I went to a GMA study, and I found in that GMA study some interesting numbers. Some of them were totally pulled out of the air, like the red line. They said food fraud costs an estimated $10 to $15 billion a year. We don't know what that number is really based on. It was one of the numbers that are pulled out of heaven and then used as a way to economically grapple with the problem, even though they may or may not have any basis. So, but what the GMA study does for the first time, it tells us what a serious incident of food fraud can cost us. It says that $40 million per incident for a medium to small company that's truly the victim of food fraud. But when it jumps up to a large company, that little 60 million jumps to 400 million, which means that it is something that we have to pay attention to. We've got to lower these numbers in order, you know, to cut our losses. The conclusion of this session is, hey, this stuff is really expensive. It's not just that people were talking about it, but it really, truly is a huge loss factor for the industry. Now, what I'm going to do is, Bruce, can we quit at this point and see if there are any questions? And then I'll run through the last two sections. Last section.
Yeah, you didn't want to go to the next because it wasn't time for questions, but if you want to, please unmute your...
It's easier to see what the questions are at this point, and then get a feel from the audience, and then I will go on to who commits it.
Alrighty. Any questions so far?
I think my main question was answered. I was asking who are these losses hitting the most? Is it you just looking at companies, or more generally how they're hitting the economy?
Well, actually both. And that's one of the conundrums with food fraud, is that with the underreporting and basically leaving the industry responsible for correcting the problem, we don't really know what the division is. We don't know. That's one of the reasons that there's been, in my opinion, very little scientific analysis of the problem. And I think that's why we have to do much, much better in determining our numbers so that I can give you answers to those problems. But I don't believe there's anyone out there right now, based on the anecdotal nature of the data, that could give you a good answer to your question.
No, I think you're right.
And that's part of the problem, because if we don't understand food fraud, how are we going to really find out what we got to ask and what we got to do to prevent it?
Mm.
So a major issue for us. Okay, if there are no more questions at this point, I'd like to shift gears and talk a little bit about the bad guys. Joe, you mentioned at the beginning, thinking like the criminal. I'd like everybody to kind of shift gears and think like a criminal for a few minutes. Who's committing food fraud? Well, there are three types of bad actors out there. There are crusaders, there are criminals, and there are just people who are plain crazy. I can guarantee you right now, based on all that I know, that food fraudsters fall into that middle category called criminals. They are all criminals, okay? And it's really that simple. And so the bottom line is, with criminals, you're dealing with rational actors who are after something, okay? And all criminals think alike. There isn't a wide disparity. This is part of the easy part of the problem. First off, they all want money. That's what motivates them. They aren't stupid. They either look for, and in the case of criminal enterprises, actually create exploitable weaknesses so that they can make money. They need other people really badly. They can't act alone, especially if they're doing fraud on an industrial scale. They need a system, an organized structure, and they also need the facilities to do the deed. Last, but certainly not least, is they have to execute their crimes. They generally use stealth for the reason that they don't want to get caught, especially if they're organized, because it represents a long-term revenue, illicit revenue stream to the criminal enterprise. So they're going to try and avoid getting caught. So this is the way they think. Now, when you look at the questions we're currently asking about food fraud across all those commodity lines, you got to ask yourself, are we really asking the right questions based on what the criminals think, and just as importantly, what they're going to do in real terms, specific terms? And I think you'll find very quickly the answer is no, we're not currently doing that. We're not doing it. The questions are too hard. So, two types of criminal actors engaged in food fraud. One is the criminal enterprise, or as we more commonly know it, organized crime. They use economic and physical intimidation to do their job. Large companies are frequently, I say may, but I'm going to tell you on the call, they're frequently complicit in the crime. It's like the fake chocolate analogy that I gave you earlier. We're purposely adding the vegetable oils to cut the cocoa butter, and we're selling it, and we are a large company that's in business. So we're our worst known enemy in some cases. And in these types of criminal enterprises, employees are always complicit. They're involved in it, okay? On the petty fraud side, which is really we consider to be a small part of the food fraud problem, they will use physical intimidation. They're very professional in what they do. They follow the same way you think. This one includes gangs. Luckily, gangs don't frequently get involved in food fraud. And in this case, employees may or may not be complicit. It depends on the specific opportunity. So these are the types of criminal actors who engage in food fraud. What is a criminal enterprise? I use the FBI's definition here, but Europol and others use the same definition. You can see the key words in the red: a formalized structure, primary motivation is money, use of actual or threatened violence, they corrupt public officials, and they use graft and extortion to accomplish their objectives. Now, what those 5 factors tell us is, hey, if you're doing food fraud on an industrial scale, you're dealing with a criminal enterprise. You're not dealing with a petty shyster. That there's one huge lesson that comes out of this research. is that we may not be focusing our attention on the most significant threat, which is the criminal enterprise, not the petty shyster. So, what are some of the important differences between the two? Well, The Godfather is probably, the movie, is probably as good a model as any to understand the power of the criminal enterprise. And all of us have seen that movie. They're long-term, highly organized, solidarity among the group, very strong and very consistent leadership. They make oaths, life oaths, to be criminals, and they use physical intimidation, payoffs, and bribes, graft and corruption, reaching the highest levels of organization. But petty crime is different, usually done by a few individuals who simply see a moment of opportunity. That's the kind of petty fraud we see. They just see one opportunity, and it's spontaneous, and they take advantage of it. Even shysters have a code of conduct, which is basically, and it doesn't work very well for us on the other side of the receiving end of the food fraud problem, is because they agree not to rat on each other. Okay? That's the code of conduct if you're a criminal. Small criminal groups, the leadership is transitory. They don't use force unless they get caught red-handed mostly, and they don't have any of the means necessary to apply coordinated economic leverage. So the bottom line is these guys are not capable of doing industrial-scale food fraud. And yet, if you look at the questions we're currently asking, almost all of those questions focus on these guys. They don't focus on the much harder, tougher question of organized crime. Conclusion, pretty clear. If food fraud losses are between $6 to $15 billion a year on whoever you talk about, who's more involved, petty shysters or the criminal enterprise? It's our conclusion based on the anecdotal evidence with a lot of indicators that it's bigger, that it is in fact criminal enterprises that are conducting these activities, especially when you look at Horse-Gate in Europe, olive oil, honey, and milk, and melamine. I mean, it all tells us this is an organized criminal enterprise where we need to focus our new attention. In the next webinar, what I will do is I will spend some time talking about ways to fight this problem. And if there's one thing I want to leave the audience with is, based on our analysis, there are very, very significant things that we could be doing and should be doing that can make a huge impact on reducing the losses associated with food fraud. And here are 7 examples. I'm going to go into detail of examples during the next webinar. And with that, I'd like to ask if folks have any questions at this point, and before I jump into means and methods.
To what extent have you considered money laundering in all of this? Because this is obviously an big organized crime activity as well. So if you want to get your resources, it's one way of channeling monies from other criminal activities.
Yeah, excellent question. Where there's organized crime, there's very, very important intelligence. Now, one of the things that the organized crime folks have to do, because they're organized and they bring in tremendous revenues from their food fraud, is they have to find ways to launder that money, okay? And one of the ways to launder money is through human trafficking. You can launder money through, gambling, illegal gambling activities. You can launder money through the drug trade. And there seem to be very, very significant indicators and warnings about who a criminal enterprise is and your ability to identify them. And one of the things that we're doing to crack that nut is we're adding to our toolkit of ways to fight food fraud, an intelligence platform that basically looks at 7 indicators of a criminal enterprise as it relates to food commodities, which is a critical aspect of cracking this organized crime nut. And it answers, the question that some of the skeptics asked earlier. Remember, the skeptics we had talked to had said, hey, golly gee whiz, just give us the names so we can go and arrest these guys. What we're trying to do is do that for them. We're trying to give them all the indicators and warnings when they're working in a place like Ivory Coast, right? And they're a chocolate producer. Hey, guys, you need to be aware that virtually all of the cocoa harvesting in Ivory Coast is done by children, which is contrary to, UN agreements that we've all signed and everything else. Yeah. Now, how do you crack that nut? The only way to crack the nut is through intelligence, and that's what we're going to provide them.
John, I posted a story this morning about how Mexico's crime families are laundering money, and one of them is through the beef industry, cattle farm raising.
Absolutely. And that's why one of the big dangers, Bruce, in our opinion scientifically, and a bad policy decision really, was the issue involving horse meat and the slaughtering of horse meat within the United States. That could actually make it much more difficult for us to avoid the problems that Europe has experienced in a horse game. So what we're talking about has tremendous implications, both politically as well as financially.
There was another one this morning, I can't remember if it was Bruce or somebody else posted it on one of the LinkedIn groups, but a lot of investment in French wineries is also a cover for international money laundering as well.
Yes, ma'am, and I haven't touched alcoholic beverages here yet. Yes, all I can say is yes, absolutely. And I'm working data right now to look at the alcoholic and beverage industry in particular. But it's a huge problem for them too, obviously. Okay.
And I think it's okay.
If there are no more questions, I'll go into part two.
What was Lisa about to say?
I was just going to make an observation that in a lot of money laundering, the businesses set up actually have all the hallmarks of being legitimate businesses. They're not always easy to spot as being money laundering activity.
Absolutely. And that's part of the reason that intelligence becomes so important, Lisa. And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to ferret that intelligence out so that the food industry can actually have something to act on. Not just, these guys sitting in the shadows doing their bad stuff.
Well, I think there's also a big knock-on. There's a big review going on at the moment, looking at how do we make sure that the whole supply chain integrity is more robust going forwards. And let's say I'm manufacturer A. At the moment, I would go out, well, I might not even do an audit. I'd send a questionnaire. I'd get them to fill in my questionnaire, and I'd tick it in a file, and that might be job done, or I might go and visit them, but I might be only looking at food safety and food quality. There's nothing that actually links up with the procurement, the integrity of the business in the whole process that's hugely missing in the equation.
Right, it's part of this nebulous area, that there isn't enough information even at the beginning to even identify who these, well, I call them illicit processors are. So that's why we're building this base of data. It's a critical first step to systematically understanding the problem, which I will show you in the next section, which involves food fraud, means, and methods. Now, I'll admit we have 10 minutes, so I'm going to fly through this information, but it will be available to you, Bruce, and others out there listening to this to look at. But here's where all of that stuff that I talked about, that probably all of us intuitively understood, now begins to make some scientific meaning associated with it. And I think it's about the way you think of the problem that's so important. And that's what I'm trying to get across by these slides. So let's go through this, and it's designed to give a framework for doing a threat assessment. Okay? So, for example, we have 3 things that the bad guy does, and this is called in law enforcement the MO, or mode of operation, or modus operandi of a criminal. First of all, they look for means and different ways that the job can be done, and then they choose the specific things they're going to do. So it's not a very hard concept but it's a critical concept if we are going to defeat the food fraudster. So keep this in mind as I go through the rest of the slides very quickly. Now, what we've done in slide number 12, as you can see, I've taken across, horizontally across the top column, all of the different food commodities that are most hard hit by food fraud. And then I've tried to represent the de minimis, or the least number, the ones that really, really are involved in actual fraud events, down the left-hand column under means vertically. So many products can be cut, like milk, olive oil, or whatever, and burgers, by adding fillers or doing other things. Adding fillers is a big one. Adding sugars, honey is a huge one here, and juices, we add sugars. Chemical treatment to change flavor, lots of commodities involved. Clouding agents, and also clouding agents should also include clarification agents, and they affect many, or actually just two major product lines, which is olive oil in this case, and juices. Disguising the speciation of what it is that you're selling, disguising the spoiling, and that's either a harvest date or an expiration date. Disguised flora, that's a honey problem. This is where the Chinese tell us that you're drinking or eating orange blossom honey when you're actually eating, you know, cesium-134 honey, okay? Disguised chemical and biological content affects all of the products. Then we have mislabeling, which is, mislabeling means that you put a false label on the product at the time you package it in the processing facility. Relabeling means that you're working in some segment of the product chain with a finished product that you're changing the labels. So an example would be you're taking olive oil that's labeled as non-extra virgin, and you're putting extra virgin labels on it in order to sell it for a higher price. So they're two different things. But you can see by looking at the X's both horizontally and vertically that you can create what are called risk clusters. So this chart tells us right away that the one thing that every commodity has to worry about is mislabeling across the board, which means where does mislabeling occur, according to my definition? At the processor level. Processors, processors, processors. The second most serious one is chemical treatment. It affects olive oil, milk, honey, juices, and it goes down the list. And so what I'm beginning to do, both horizontally and vertically, is creating what we call risk clusters if you do risk management. Okay? Very, very important first step. Then next, what we do is we take the production segment. I want to know what the means are, what the affected commodities are, and I want to know at what point along the production segment is it happening. Now I want you to all look at one thing. Look at the number of X's vertically and horizontally. And if you look vertically under processor, look what we find. Isn't that amazing? That shows us that if we really want to make a dent in food fraud, we want to ask the right questions of the right people who are processors. That's where the problem is. That's where the question should be. That's where we should be focusing the vast majority of our resources. The next thing is if you go through, and we have a series of slides. I'm not going to go through them all, but I will go through a couple of these just to give you an idea. We have seafood, for example. I've listed the means in the second column. These are the things that you can do to conduct fraud for seafood. And if, as you go through this information for us, everybody who's participating, we need you to add anything you can think of. But we think this is the complete list. We believe this is the only way that you can commit seafood fraud is through those means, based on our scientific analysis. Okay? And then we say, okay, we know what the means are, but what are the methods? How are they going to do it? Well, if they're going to chemically treat a product like seafood, they have to use coloring and flavoring agents. So one of the first things you ask questions about is coloring and flavoring when you're at the processor. Okay? And now you know exactly where to focus your question for the biggest bang for the buck, which is what the food business is all about. Disguising speciation. I can tell you the #1 way to disguise speciation in food is by freezing the product and then taking the product, frozen product, and putting it into upline processing. You're losing billions of dollars right there. Every year that's being done. That's done at processing facilities. Not to say that we don't have some other problems with food that I'll get to in a minute. Disguising spoilage, disguising the origin. You know, Chilean sea bass, right? Caught in the Potomac. Not very delightful thought, but it's happening. Okay? And all of the other things, let's take a look at olive oil. Cutting is the big thing here. And I have all of the oils that they would use to do it. And, you know, one of the reasons that avocado oil isn't there is because it's too expensive. It would cost them too much money to use avocado oil if they're cutting. Okay? And you can deduce certain scientific characteristics out of this data. Here's milk. And if, by the way, this is a global problem, but if you really like your milk, consider what they do in India. They combine oil, urea, detergent, caustic soda, sugar, salt, and skim milk powder to produce whole milk that they serve over there. It's not very pleasant, and it is a huge problem. Next and last but not least is honey. And you can see honey is basically adding Caro syrup and disguising flora. That's basically an over-filtering honey. And, of course, the way you can determine whether honey is real or not is by the pollen count that's in the final product. And when you test, remember what the numbers were. Honey on the shelf, what you're finding is there's no pollen in it. It means it's been so filtered for coloration that it's not pure honey. It's Caro syrup mixed with maybe a touch of that. We have the same thing for rice that you can look at when we have the time. We also have milk chocolate, which is a huge problem. And again, this goes back to the processor. And we have rice, okay, and we finally have beef. Okay? I think those charts give you the idea. Now, there's a very important reason that we systematically structure the data we have from the beginning of the presentation. Here's how it's been structured. First, we told you what the affected commodities were based on the anecdotal scope of the problem. We told you what the bad guy means by commodity type was. We told you the bad guy means by supply chain segment. We told you the specific methods that are used by the bad guy by commodity type. And last but not certainly least, the means, the level of risk by segment of the production chain, and the specific food fraud methods that will be used by the bad guy. The question is, how can we put all of that information together in some structured way that guides us to the next step, which is looking at countermeasures? And so we end our presentation today with the following meatball chart, which, by the way, is the most important part of the presentation. So like at the wedding of Cana, we saved the best wine for last, okay? We structure the data so you can do some pretty remarkable things with it in terms of really looking realistically at food fraud. We tell you what needs to be protected, why it needs to be protected, and what it specifically needs to be protected against, which is fundamentally what you have to do before you begin the process of looking at food fraud. So what you can see here is the huge cluster of reds at the processor level and the huge cluster of reds at the organized crime level, which tells you processors of the problem and organized crime to commit industrial-scale food is the problem. And that's the end of my presentation. It's now 12 noon. Are there any questions before I talk a little bit about the next session?
Well, I'd just like to say that that chart in itself is quite startling, because you've analysed it all systematically, and when you've done that, it actually looks quite simple. And this is where I think where we can help to add huge value to the whole thing, because everybody's faced with tackling the whole thing individually, and it's absolutely, they don't know where to start. So actually to crystallise it like that, I think is an extraordinarily powerful thing in itself.
Yeah, I think the value here, and the only value of this session, is really to create a structure, a way that all of us can look at the food fraud problem, regardless of what commodities we sell or our location on the production chain. What we can use is common lingo. You know, it's a systematic structure that we can all share. And that's why we started off with getting to this point in our first session. The next session will build on this, and we will be able to really say, okay, what are the specific things that we can do to deal with this little meatball chart? And that's where I'm hoping to go. Okay? If there are no more questions, I'll finish off by saying what we're going to do over the next session. By now, I think I've hit the 5 things that I promised to do at the beginning. We know about means and methods, and we know we have a threat assessment, and we know where we should focus our attention. The next thing is going to be, okay, big deal. You told us where it is and all that. What do we do about it? That's where we're going to get into, on the 4th, a discussion about countermeasures, how we can use countermeasures to tell us specifically whether or not we're the victims of food fraud, both from petty shysters, but more importantly from the organized criminal enterprise standpoint. That will serve the basis for us to move to the session number 3, which is, okay, we have the problem. How do we assess it? Once we have this baseline, then what we're going to do is take all of the comments that we've received from industry, and we're out there actively working with industry now, and then we're going to put it together for you to look at. So there'll be lots of people on the last webinar, because we're going to be, just like Microsoft, seeking inputs on how this product should work for you, not for us. It's going to be no use for us unless it's, you know, built for industry. So that's one of the big reasons for today's briefing. Preview, we're going to look at, give you a capsule summary of what we did today. We're going to show you how you can extract lessons learned to do things like write the right questions and ask the right questions. We're going to address some specific countermeasures you can take to stop it. We're going to discuss how to structure food fraud loss prevention programs. And finally, we're going to give you a preview of our next, the 3rd ILS session. And with that, I want to thank everybody for being so patient and listening to this information. And we're more than willing to share it with you. And we would love to do that to get your feedback. So thank you very much for attending.
Again,
Thank you.
We will post this on the National Food Protection Collaboratory site. I will send everybody the link so that you can share it with your employees or other people that you think might be interested. Please let us know if this is meeting your needs. It's very important to get some feedback on this so that we know how to we want to make sure that the next session meets whatever you want it to meet. So please provide feedback. Let us know what you liked and what you maybe did not like, and we'll take that into consideration for the next webinar. Joe, do you want to say anything before we finish?
Well, I just want thank you very much again for sharing this with me. I'm very excited by where it's all going. I hope everybody else feels the same way. I don't know whether we want to give everybody a chance to sort of say anything at this stage or wait for feedback after the event. I can hear murmurs and voices and rumblings going on. So I'm just conscious that there might be some comments that people are wanting to make right now. I might be completely wrong.
That would be wonderful. If anybody has any comments, please, or observations, please help us out.
I think I'd like to think it over, but I'll certainly send any comments back by email or otherwise.
That would be great. We'd really appreciate, again, any comments that you have to help us through this. Our job is to actually build something that makes a difference for the industry, and that's why we're running this series of webinars with small groups, kind of the leading edge of the problem. We're willing to confront a really tough issue. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
All righty. Have a good day, everyone.
Have a good day, everybody.